Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the National University Speaker Series. We welcome all of you participating in today's webinar from the extended National University family. Our audience today includes current students, alumni, staff, faculty, as well as many guests from the community simply interested in today's intriguing topic. My name is Nancy Rowland Heinrich, and I serve as the Executive Vice President for Communications and Community Engagement for National University. I have had the honor of serving as the host of the National University Speaker Series since its inception in July 2020. Thus far, we have held more than 20 webinars with very interesting topics, amazing presenters, and great discussions. We appreciate your interest in innovation, as it certainly is a hot topic in all industries and organizations. Today, we're honored to feature Dr. Steve Johnson as our distinguished speaker. Steve serves as the Senior Vice President of Innovation for National University. He has a very impressive bio and brings great experience as a transformative, forward-looking thought leader driving innovative projects and enhancing organizational performance. He is very accomplished in the area of innovation, leading efforts in that area, working in many diverse industries, including higher education, the defense industry, as well as in the military. Dr. Johnson is a graduate of West Point and served in the U.S. Army for more than a decade. Thank you for your service. Steve later completed his master's and doctorate in English at the University of Washington in Seattle. We all look forward to better understanding the role of innovation and whether it is truly innovative. During this session, please submit any questions that you may have in the chat. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A period, which will be moderated by our very own Dr. John Cicero, the Provost of National University. Welcome, Dr. Cicero. We look forward to hearing more from Steve, sharing his insights on the topic of whether innovation is still innovative. So everyone, please join me in welcoming our speaker for the NU Speaker Series, Dr. Steve Johnson. Steve?
Thank you, Nancy. Let me get my slide set up, please. And okay, and then I need to hit this button. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for that great introduction. I want to thank you and your team for including me in the speaker series and for the great support I've had from you. And Dr. Cicero, glad to be with you today. Thank you for agreeing to facilitate this conversation. Really proud to be part of National University for the last 18 months and looking ahead to a lot of the exciting things that are coming for this university. It's great to be in an innovation role here. Also, I'd like to thank all of you who took time out of your day to join this conversation. Look forward to hearing your questions, your thoughts. And for those of you, it's evening here on the East Coast. I'm up in New Hampshire, and I know for some of you, it's early afternoon out in the West Coast. So again, thank you all for being here. I was looking at some of our attendees, and I have to notice my old colleague, Ross Pollock. I believe Ross is enrolled at North Central University working on his doctorate. We were captains together in the Army in South Korea in the late 90s. So it's nice to see familiar folks showing up, and thanks for being here, Ross. A quick public service announcement also before I get into today's talk, because I know you're all hanging on the edge of your seats about my question. My parents were both first gen into higher ed. And so in some regards, my being here today is because they both were courageous in their families and took that path. My dad he was the first and only member of his family, his immediate family, to go to college right out of high school. My mom went out of high school as well, but she ended up being an adult learner. And because they both made that choice, it gave opportunities to me that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And so with that, it's one of the things that makes National very special to me, working around so many of you who are adult learners, working on bachelor's degrees, working on masters, those and PhDs and EDDs, those the pursuit of that education, it carries on to your progeny and to others around you. So you may not recognize it, but in doing this, you are not only finding opportunity for yourself, but you're finding opportunity for those around you who you inspire, and those who are right there next to you through your lives. So thanks for doing that. And again, just so pleased to be part of this mission for lifelong learners. Okay, so my title is Innovation Still Innovative? In about 30 minutes, I'm sure we will just nail that down. It's a play on words in all seriousness. And conceptually, in asking this question, I was really kind of getting at two things. One, the concept disruptive innovation. Clayton Christensen introduced this term, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. Clayton introduced this term about 25 years ago. And so in some regards, the idea of disruptive innovation as being an innovative concept, not innovative at all. At the same time, one of the things that's jumped out at me, and I was talking to a colleague of mine who is a former Clayton Christensen fellow, and he was expressing some frustration that 25 years later, established organizations, after Clayton Christensen laid out a blueprint for how to engage with disruptive innovation, established organizations still don't do very well with it. And so in that regard, what I really want to tackle today is, yes, there's a lot of innovative things that existing organizations can be doing to better see disruptive innovation emerging, address it, and embrace it. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So I'll cover a little bit in the realm of who is this Clayton Christensen guy, for some of you who may not be quite as familiar with the work of Dr. Christensen, and then talk about some places where I see organizations haven't moved forward. And then at the very end of this talk, I want to get to some emerging disruptive innovations that we're seeing around us. Specifically, if you've seen news about a new platform called ChatGPT, which is a natural language AI program, there's some really fascinating things to recognize about how it's changing products, services, and will likely change many organizations and how we do things as humans in the not distant future. So that's where I'm kind of headed today. Really, at the end of this, want to get to why do startups do so well and our existing organizations really struggle. But at the bottom of this, I really want you to hopefully take away some things that are like, these are things I can take back to my organization, and these are things I can do personally. So that's also part of this work ahead. So The Innovator's Dilemma was a book that Clayton Christensen published in 1997. This is a long quote, but maybe you can take that in. I'll get to it in a minute. There are really three things that I want to draw out of this book that are relevant to today. And so if you haven't read it, don't worry. You don't probably have to read it at this point, 25 years later. It's so cited. There's so many people who have drawn their ideas from this work. It's been very useful. But there are three things that happen in this book that are really important. One, Christensen he lays out what disruptive innovation is and why it's important. And I will give you an example on my next slide when I get to this, but he establishes this term, disruptive innovation, this idea that a technology can be deployed in a low quality product or service, and it then relentlessly moves to the top of what he calls a market and knocks off well-established products and services, and is the downfall of companies and sectors and those kinds of things. Secondly, this quote really gets at one of his questions, which is, startup companies are really good at deploying these kinds of disruptive innovations. Existing companies are really bad at dealing with them because they're so good at what they do. And when you look at this quote, he talks about, we listen carefully to our own customers, or in our case, our students. Now we track our competitors in the now. We build higher performance and quality products and services that we're already delivering. We keep improving those. And so because we're so focused on the now, we miss what's coming, and we miss reacting and adjusting to it. So it's a really important component. And then the last thing, the third thing to take away from the book is he starts providing advice to existing organizations about what they can do. And one of them is he advises organizations to innovate on the side. In many regards, you have a core organization that delivers a product or service, and this is Christensen's words, not mine. And he advocates for developing a side business that incubates, and eventually you disrupt yourself. That's kind of his concept of what happens. That's the thing that, as I'm looking at the past 25 years, I want to draw a problem to when I get to it. But before I do, what I want to give you is some examples. So, he published this book in 1997, and then the late 90s through today have been a long list of both particular businesses and industries, markets, sectors that have all faced disruption. An easy one to go to is Blockbuster. I'm a child of the 80s. My family used to go, and Friday nights we'd head to Blockbuster, rent our VHS tapes, and that way we could watch movies before they got to TV and got lots of commercials breaking them up and those things. In the late 90s, Blockbuster came online, as you know, and they had a mail order DVD service. And that DVD service really was the start of a massive decline for Blockbuster's business model, because people would rather walk out to their mailbox and get a DVD than drive to the local Blockbuster store and rent a VHS tape. And Blockbuster had, by that time, DVDs as well. So how does this fit Christensen's idea? Blockbuster did two things. They took the internet, which was up and coming, and figured out how to leverage it. And then they took the advent of the DVD and used a low quality service, the US Mail, to deliver those DVDs, because they were smaller and weighed less than a VHS tape. So we could put them in the mail and collect them and ship them and manage them using the internet, using credit cards and those kinds of things. So that's just a quintessential, easy to get your mind around disruption. Low quality, deployed into a market reaching different customers, rural areas, people who couldn't drive to Blockbusters. Over time, it cramped Blockbuster's business style. Now, Blockbuster, there's more to this story. Blockbuster pivoted very quickly and came up with their own internet-based mail service, if you may remember, if you were involved in this. Netflix took Clayton Christensen's advice. They developed on the side a new business, and they incubated it. And that business was what we now do. I'm sure most of you have some kind of streaming access to Netflix or Hulu. Netflix started that. They were courageous enough to blow up their own business model. And so by the time Netflix had their mail service up and running, Blockbuster had their mail service up and running. Netflix was already moving along with deploying streaming, and you could start streaming or order. I remember this. There's a lot of consternation inside of Netflix, if I remember correctly, because the people who were part of the mail service saw the demise of their own jobs as this new part of the business erupted. I think that part of this textbook innovation work is less successful across the whole of established organizations. Netflix was a startup, but once it was established, it blew up its own model, so to speak. That's less common. And that's really what I want to get to today, is most established companies and sectors really struggle with this. And you can see these others, Kodak, with digital imagery. They had the technology, but they didn't want to deploy it because they liked photography. They believed in photography. Smartphones, Nokia had the smartphone. Obviously, Nokia had ideas about the smartphone, but they didn't want to give up their cell phone service on its own. And here comes Apple and many others behind them, and Nokia took this long decline. Disruption doesn't result in a popping of a balloon where something just disappears. It's more like a deflation if you see some of these extended time periods. So it takes a while. But the music industry, thanks to Napster, rethinking what you do with an MP3 file, the music industry that used to control the distribution of music lost that to consumers. You can now go find anything on just about any of the paid services that exists. The news industry hollowed out. There's some big papers still out there, but most of your local mom and pop papers are gone or still dying. It's still moving along. And the film industry, thanks to Blockbuster, the Netflix didn't only disrupt Blockbuster, it disrupted a whole film industry and a distribution process. And so that has significantly changed. So these are just some examples. There are many, many more that I haven't listed, but just to wet your whistle. So what's going on here? Why 25 years later can't organizations get their mind around being disrupted? I was rereading recently, this question was on my mind. I was rereading Nick Obolinski's book, Complex Adaptive Leadership, Embracing Paradox and Uncertainty. And I stumbled on this graphic. Sorry, it's a little fuzzy, perhaps. I don't know why it didn't copy over, but this graphic kind of gave me oh, that makes sense. And while he was focusing on why leadership has struggled in sort of the 20th and 21st century to keep pace with many things, I think it really applied to the innovation idea as well. And what he has, as you look at this, several different charted paths for different kinds of technologies and human awareness, which in the late 20th century have really exponentially changed. So everything from, he's listing military technology, communications, but you can add all, computing, all kinds of things you can think of. And our awareness, our ability to access information has grown exponentially from that set of world books my parents had on the bookshelves when I was a 7-year-old. For those of you who remember world books. But what hasn't changed, or what hasn't changed exponentially, is how we think about leadership and organizing ourselves to grapple with this work. And so that's really what I want to focus on here, because that was to me, when I look at this, oh, well, that makes sense. Over the past 25 years, all of these technologies that are disrupting things, all of these startup organizations, they've been radically changing in the past 25 years, but most of our organizations on the whole, and again, I'm speaking very generally, I know there's exceptions to everything I'm talking about here, they've stayed pretty steady state. We're still here 25 years later. So this is really the problem. This is the place where I sit there and go, yes, innovation is still innovative and needs to be innovative, perhaps in ways we haven't focused on. Part of the question here was Clayton Christensen's advice to existing organizations not so great? It's so hard for an organization to do what Netflix did and blow up its own business model, its own product, its own mission and vision for what it is. That is a really difficult thing to ask an organization to go through. Is there a better or different way? And I'm going to get to it. I think yes, but I don't have the specifics here. So if you're waiting around for those, I'm sorry. But what I do have is I think in asking this question, so where should we think about innovating? What I warrant is there's some places in our organizational structures and cultures that we can go. So really want to focus here in this next part of the talk, just to look at how do we need to develop people? How do we need to start thinking about structuring ourselves differently? How do we organize large, complex organizations differently than we're used to thinking about them? And then culture. culture, many of you heard that old culture eats strategy for breakfast. It eats a lot of things for breakfast. And so if you don't have a culture, you can't do so many things you envision. And at the end of that, I kind of want to get to what can you do about this problem? And I think in combined ways, we can do a lot. I don't imagine I'm the first person to notice that we really need to go back to organizations. People have been talking about this all along, but here we are 25 years later. So I think it's really important to continue to emphasize that message and really think about it. So intentionally developing people. One of the things Clay Christensen did with two of his colleagues, Jeff Dyer and Hal Gregerson, around 2011, is they went out and they surveyed about 500 then known innovators, people they would call innovators, and about 5,000 executives from across many different, sectors and areas, in trying to determine what makes a good innovator a good innovator. And they came back with 5 sort of behavioral skills that they identified. And those are these key areas that I've listed over here. And in their chart that I placed here to the right, so there's a cultural thing, courage, it's challenging the status quo, some of those things. But they recognize that a key behavior was people who could conduct associative thinking, and through these other skills out there. And that's a fascinating revelation. And I'll talk about these skills in a minute. But in my mind, how many of you are in organizations that are at this point intentionally cultivating associational thinking? Probably not many. If you are, you're probably in a fantastic place. We still suffer from that same critique that Christensen put out. We're so good at delivering on the now that we really struggle to envision what is coming and how we can use it in an innovative way, because we're real comfortable with what we're doing. And so my argument here is not that we throw out how we develop people to replace it with something in this area, but this is really a both and argument. It's how do we get people to and build organizations that are really good, still good at the now, but also really start to work into this deficit space. And so again, associating skills. And then they laid out these 4 areas underneath that people are really good at questioning the status quo, asking why things happen, why do we do it this way, all of those kinds of things. Observing what people do, which I think is a point of empathy. Networking, connecting out beyond your area of expertise or what you work in, and then that experimental mindset. This recently, David Epstein, if you ever read the book Range, he tackles generalism and why in uncertain times, being a generalist is a very often outperforms what we call an expert. It's very affable to this kind of thing. He's thinking about lateral thinking and growing breadth. And in many regards, he's advocating for the same kinds of skill sets in people so that you have depth in certain areas and expertise, but we're broadening people so that they can start, we call it lateral thinking, call it associative thinking, but that they can start making connections on behalf of the organization, right? You don't want your senior vice president of innovation to be the only person who has ideas. To the contrary, we need to be training our organizations so that everybody has those ideas, whether they're sustaining innovations to what we do and making what we do better, or having ideas about, wow, let's blow something up and challenge it and do something different that's going to be even better for more people or for different people that we don't serve. And everybody's an innovator is a philosophy. Christensen, Dyer, and Gregerson espouse that in their book, and David Epstein also does. And so, if your organization isn't thinking in these terms, I hope to hear me, go inspire your organization to start in your own place. And I'll talk about that a little more in the end. The other thing then, in conjunction with that, is we got to train our leaders differently. So how do you train a leader to think about the now and the future? And I'm not necessarily talking about your CEO or your president. I'm talking about leaders at depth, because many leaders in many organizations, once you get to a certain level, I'm incentivized to deliver on the now. I'm incentivized to bring the now into being. Great. You're also incentivized to break things, to grow what you're doing, to change direction, because you're now associating and thinking more broadly. How do we bring people together differently? So one of the things I've constrained in that is the assumption that everybody works in a hierarchy. So my next area here to talk about is organizational structures. And this is real quick, just a sampling from sort of three different folks who have Nick Obolensky, who I mentioned earlier, Frederick Laloux, and Bob Johansen. Three different folks who have theorized ways of changing organizations into organizations that break significantly from traditional hierarchical structures. What I find interesting is their metaphors that they're looking at are very similar. And that's what I want to focus on here, not whether one of them is right or spot on, but they're theorizing. And so Nick Obolensky really gets to the idea of a complex adaptive system, if you're familiar with that concept. If not, Frederick Laloux thinks about organisms, and an organism is a complex adaptive system. It's a place where so much is happening, you can't control it from a top down. You have to be able to manage and work and look for things that emerge. And I know I'm way skimming the surface on some heavy theoretical stuff, but I'll kind of come back to some closure. Bob Johansen from the Institute of the Future, this is his diagram on the right. His metaphor is computing, moving from centralized to, I think many, you call a matrixed organization, sort of distributed in many regards, but he advocates the future organization is going to be what we would call a network. It's going to be nodes talking to nodes, and hierarchy doesn't really factor into it. In fact, he lays out the metaphor of a shape-shifting organization where certain nodes lead certain things, and as the organization changes, other things rise, but people are very comfortable with that. So all this to say, our old views of sort of the king has his lords and ladies who have their vassals, and this sort of hierarchical working that came from the Middle Ages that we've improved on, if you think back to that chart I showed, in a linear fashion. That's not enough to see emerging innovation, embrace it, and do something with it. It's really limiting us. And so starting to think in these kind of metaphors, how do we think about thinking of our organizations not as machines, but as organisms? How do we think about them as complex adaptive systems that the best thing a leader can do is work to encourage emergent behaviors, but also the bottom up is going to emerge them. Nick Obolensky calls it polyarchy. It's a mix of hierarchy and chaos and anarchy. And so there's some really interesting ideas out there. I just switch you on to those, but that's a place to really be thinking about innovation. Last, leaders have to orchestrate cultural change. And so there's a lot to do here. There's a lot packed in this slide. I won't go through it all. I talked about top down has to get balanced with that bottom up. And I think in times of emergency and crisis, leaders are really good at the top down. When things are going easier, we can work with the bottom up. It's a lot harder. It's a lot more complex. But how do you balance that, and how do you actually use it in innovative ways? It's a question that's out there. This diagram on the right, it's an old results pyramid. If you want to change actions and results of any person, you have to start at what they believe. And if what they believe doesn't align with the result you're looking for, the only way to change their belief is to give them new experiences. And so lots of things leaders can do is by seeding experiences by taking experiences into different parts of their organizations and making sure people see things. Oh, that's not right. I could never use that tool. Well, tell me what, I'd like you to go be in a demo and go try out this tool and see what you think. And they come back and like, huh, that was actually not what I thought it was. This is great. You've given somebody an opportunity to run a pilot. Their beliefs have changed. Now what they do with that technology, actions and results. So tiny example, but that's a really important concept to consider. Incentivizing folks differently, right? It's not just delivering on the now. So instead of that cultivation of innovation on the side, how do you incentivize your existing organization to innovate itself? Committing to foresight. There are a lot of organizations that are starting to do this. How do you get people in your organization who help the organization take a longer view and consider it and use that to its advantage in how it plans and how it addresses risk and opportunity? And last, one thing that comes to me, one of the fascinating and fun parts of National is we are a remote organization. I know we have many employees who are out in San Diego, many who are in the Scottsdale area, but we are all over. And that gives us an opportunity to think about how an organization works differently as an example. But if you're in a remote organization, it seems to be inviting laboratory work and thinking about how do we get networked? How do we think about our organization differently? All right. So in wrapping up, I kind of took you through Clayton Christensen, took you through what I think a problem is, and then laid out a case for here's some skills that you should be thinking about in your organization, organizational structure, and the orchestration of cultural change. So what do you do? When I talked briefly, and I just skimmed the idea of emergent behavior, there's this thing called the Lorenz effect, which you probably know is the butterfly effect. I'm a big believer in the butterfly effect, where it's an old anecdote, but somebody found in a system that was predicting the weather, a very complex adaptive system, a little change in some vibration in some wind pattern in some small country created a hurricane on the other side of the Atlantic, and in this model that was built. But that was and Lorenz discovered this, but the idea is simply small efforts often result in really big effects over time. And so emerging behavior, so being the change you want to be, if your organization isn't developing you in associative thinking, don't wait. Start using it, start doing it, and start showing people how it can benefit them. Those kinds of things would encourage you to go do your own reading, your own research into these questions, and start getting people talking about them, because those little effects over time actually manifest big change from my experience. So, in wrapping up, all of this to say disruption isn't over. It's upon us. And again, ChatGPT. So is your organization ready to be disrupted again? Is your sector ready to be disrupted? Because it is happening around us. ChatGPT is a natural language-based AI tool. Probably about 6 weeks ago, it made a big splash by being online. And you can go online and get an account for free. And this chatbot, you can ask it all kinds of things and it will come back to you, because it is a language-based AI tool, and it will pull in all kinds of information you can use. My first sitting with it, I said, hey, I need to write a 20-page paper on the Battle of Gettysburg. It needs to address why the tactical aspects of the battle, the tactical reasons for victory, and it needs to discuss the strategic implications. And it came back in probably about 5 seconds with a pretty extensive line-by-line outline that, from my background as an English professor, would be a fantastic outline for a high school student to have. and a pretty decent level 100, 200 outline for somebody writing a 20-page paper. I was floored. This is not a refined tool at this point. This is kind of like the clunky cell phone of the 80s that had the big battery. It's a signal of what's coming. ChatGPT is already making legal recommendations to people. It has a lot of caveats, so ChatGPT, so its company OpenAI can't get sued, but it can go and do legal research and come back with some pretty reasonable recommendations already. And I had Lisa Hutton, the dean of our law school, posted the other day. This is currently ChatGPT 3.5. They're anticipating somewhere between version 4 and 5 coming out that ChatGPT will actually be able to pass the bar. So, talk about an innovative disruption. Somebody has put a chatbot on the internet that's far and wide use, and it's about to make lawyers rethink their profession. In fact, AI and professions have a lot of disruption in the future coming, accountancy and AI, for instance. So just want to leave that as and certainly, Dr. Cicero, we can talk more about this if you care to, but I just want to leave this as a closing, parting thought for you is, hey, this is not just a nice little think about this innovation stuff, because disruption kind of happens. It'll be upon you in different ways coming in. And if you remember that curve, it was showing it's exponential. It's radical change in technologies are accelerating. They're not just increasing. So all that not to scare you, I'm a constant optimist. But it's scary only if we get surprised by it. We can be quite optimistic, I think, if we are ready for it and embracing it. So appreciate again your time today, your listening, and look forward to some good discussion here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was very interesting, and I think we have so many people from different generations and different parts. And when you think about what were those technologies that were innovative, what changed the workforce and things, it just gives everybody a lot to contemplate as we look at the role of innovation in the workforce and in our lives. But at this time, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. John Cicero, Provost for National University, and John will be serving as the moderator for the Q&A. Thank you to all of you who have already submitted questions in the Q&A. John will be vetting those and presenting questions for Steve for further discussion. Thank you, Dr. Cicero.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate that. And Steve, I'd also like to thank you for a really good presentation. It gives us a lot to think about. And I'm actually delighted that you finished with ChatGPT. It certainly in a lot of spaces, particularly in the educational space, this is one of the most significant innovations that's come along in quite a while. So my question, and in full disclosure, I've already prepped Steve for some of the questions I was going to ask.
Doesn't mean I remember him.
Yeah, right. You don't know if you remember him or not. So as an organization, here comes something that's incredibly innovative. For some, it's possibly threatening. What does an organization do with innovation? Do they take a defensive position? Do they embrace it? How do they vet it? What are your recommendations when these kinds of things come along?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think again, depending on the organization's situation, there has to be a little defensive. I think embracing it is really important to start with, and then how do you get out in front of it? Because if you go to my Blockbuster example, for instance, Blockbuster actually was quite agile in picking up Netflix's DVD mail service model and co-opting it for themselves, as just a simple example. But they stopped there, right? All they did was catch up. And so I think as you look at something like ChatGPT, there's a couple of steps here. So I do know in higher ed, for instance, many are really concerned. Their main concern, especially faculty, and rightly so, is plagiarism, right? Now there's this way that somebody can write a paper that's decent, and with some good editing, they can actually save a lot of work, and it's essentially plagiarized based on our definitions of plagiarism. So I think there is some real concern that has to be addressed in the near term, because there's no defense to that. But more importantly, we haven't had time to think about it. And when I look at, then there's many things ChatGPT can do that would be considered plagiarism. It can write papers, it can code, it can solve word problems and physics problems and things like that. And it's only going to get better, which is my point. So just solving the plagiarism problem in the now doesn't get higher education anywhere. There's got to be the consideration of, just like a pocket calculator, just like grammar and spell check, just like a search engine and Wikipedia. How do we address those tools and teach students what they need to learn about those tools, and how those can actually make their thinking better if they know how to use them well? So, as me as a former teacher of writing, thinking about, hey, how can, my students always struggle to get their first draft in. They never, ever really got to great editing in some of my classes. How can I use ChatGPT to start off teaching editing, which for most of you who are at graduate level, that editing and revision is where thinking really can get unlocked in ways it doesn't. You've gotten the clay, so to speak, on the paper. That's a terrible metaphor, all right? But so I think there are opportunities. So I think some of it is really, John, at a personal level, getting past resistance, addressing real concerns, but then how do I use this, and how do I even take it beyond where ChatGPT is thinking about it, right? They weren't thinking, unleashing this, that they were going to upend higher ed necessarily. They were thinking about making an AI tool available. So how do we leverage it, and what do we need that ChatGPT doesn't even do? I think those kinds of things take you into a place where you're no longer playing defense like Blockbuster was, but you're moving into a space where you're like, bring it on. Technology is changing, and what the people who come to National University need to know, that's changing. So we got to be on that, and we're going to embrace it.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go to some of the questions that have already been there. There's a good question around culture. So you covered this in your talk, but maybe you could just say it a little bit more. If you were to look at two different cultures, what are the attributes of a culture that enable and accelerate innovation? And what are the attributes of a culture that do just the opposite? Can you comment on that?
Sure. I've seen many different versions, but I think it really comes along the line of, and this is some of the stuff that Clay Christensen started with, right? It's building parts of your organization, and the cultural part is the ability to iterate, the ability to. And my example would be, in a very general sense, if you're in any organization and you take on a project, because it's a project that's meant to move into a place of the unknown, you have the opportunity to learn and iterate. And so I think in cultures that really struggle with innovation, they're places where if I try something and it doesn't work, I've failed. And that's bad, versus having reasonable latitude to try and learn and try again, because in the practices of innovation, that's how innovators work. And inventors, right? The traditional, if you want to go back to like Thomas Edison and light bulbs and how many of those things he tried and those kinds of things, scientists, and that experimental, the experimental component of the culture is there and alive and well. And that's hard. That's really hard in operational cultures, which are driven by key performance indicators and delivery metrics. And if you're not delivering those things, you're red and you're not doing your job. And so this again gets to the challenge here. I don't have the answer, but the challenge is that balance. And where I'm trying to push the boundary a bit is that experimental unit isn't just something off to the side, but certain companies that have been known for doing this well have figured out how to integrate it. An old example is 3M. They used to give employees a certain amount of time to work on their own projects, and the anecdotal story is that's where the Post-it note came from. Is somebody was working on that and it came out of their free time. So an employee had a certain amount of time to do their own experiments, and they were expected to do their own experiments. That doesn't translate into certain kinds of companies because they're not 3Ms who are developing companies and trying to find new products and those things. So that's part of the struggle here. But I do think that's the dividing line, is the ability that you can try something and it doesn't work out, and that's okay. In fact, it goes to those skills and some of those other cultural bullets I had.
Very good, very good. So this next question, I would take you in a little bit different direction. All of us, having gone through the pandemic, have discovered the possibility of totally virtual work or hybrid work. Is there any evidence that you know of that suggests that working virtually or hybrid inhibits innovation?
It certainly makes it different from my personal experience. So trying to answer your question, John, I think I can only respond from my personal level versus I do know there are a lot of companies that are in the innovation space that are pulling workers back to spaces. And so I don't know that my response is a popular one. I think, but I also think that's why one of the reasons I'm inspired to come at organizational structures around innovation differently. I have a group of 10 folks. Part of them work in an intelligence group and the other part run an innovation lab. And I've been amazed in spite of maybe it's been slower than if we had a physical space where people could have come on a campus. I've been amazed at the work that we've gotten underway and what we've learned in a short year that they've been doing the work. So I guess I don't know that it's better, it's different. We found tools. We don't have a whiteboard for 6 of us to stand around and mull things over together, but we found Miro, and that's better. It's better than just talking on Zoom, for instance. And I think for we just I got a demo a few weeks ago of a tool called in-space proximity, and when I got on there and came back to Zoom, it made Zoom just feel flat and deflated. This tool had little zeros with cameras, and you could move people around and they could talk without stepping on each other and have more organic kinds of conversations and things. And it was fascinating. And it was really built around a classroom. That's why I was looking at this with some of my colleagues. But what I expect in that, John, is those things are going to continue to emerge for organizations that are here. And just like, Zoom is still our response to the pandemic in some ways. And over time, Zoom, unless it changes, it will get disrupted as well, because people are going to find, how do we connect better in this environment? And I think when you have that, things like innovation will feel more natural, more organic, and they'll be easier to coordinate over time. But it can be done. It can be done. Oh.
Thanks for that, Steve. A lot of great questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm framing some of these questions because they've been asked different ways. So if you think about the idea of innovation or entrepreneurship, would you say innovation, let me say it this way, where is there better innovation? When you're trying to solve an existing problem, or you're innovating? You talked about the Post-it note. They weren't necessarily trying to design a Post-it note, but should we work on innovation and see what comes out of it?
I don't know that it's an either or, so some of that comes down to the innovator or the innovator group or what they're trying to do, and I think it's the difference between sort of creating and inventing. I think people would say inventing is sort of cobbling things together out of existing structures, and creating is something new. I'm often the leader of innovators as much as I am an innovator myself. So, but there is the process. I think the best way to answer that question for yourself is go find some people who, there's lots of books and you can learn a lot, but you always have to tailor it to yourself. There's no right way to really innovate. I think there's a lot of right ways to lead groups that are trying to innovate. What we try to do in the lab is Tony Fadell has a great memoir called Build, as long as you're okay with profanity, because he uses a bit of it in his writing. But Build is about his journey as a young engineer into getting to a place where he designed the iPhone for Steve Jobs, to later building his own company, which is the Nest thermostat and some of those things. And so, that would be a great example of a book where go read that and you kind of learn some things about yourself while you read about his journey. But in terms of groups and leading them, we really try to use a design thinking approach. I have my lab director is trained he's done some work online with the Stanford D School, and really is trying to bring design thinking into the work. And I think how that tends to work better for innovation, I contrast it to engineering, where you're solving a specific problem often, where design thinking is about how do I build around a user? How do I do something for a user? And I might not even know the specific problem I'm trying to solve at the beginning of the process. And often working through those, and I've had colleagues that I worked with at Southern New Hampshire University who did a lot of this as well, and kind of got me into design thinking, getting into that prototype phase, getting to try out those prototypes, and to my cultural thing, starting to iterate on a prototype and an experience. That's where you start to have aha moments. And so sometimes it's really just getting your hands dirty. And if you don't know how to do it, get a group of people and try it together. That's what I would recommend.
Steve, thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and there's about 30 in the queue here. Then I'll turn it over to Nancy so she can talk about what we're going to do with all these great questions. So here's maybe the final question I will ask. Based on your research and looking at the companies you talked about, you gave some good examples of companies. How many companies who were innovators or disruptive stayed disruptive, or did they, once they did the disruption, did they become commonplace and then someone else disrupted for them?
I think Clay Christensen would say yes. Once you're at high risk once you've established your business model or what you're delivering, whether that's a product or service, you're at high risk of over time being disrupted. ChatGPT is a great example of this. The idea of this AI-based chatbot threatens the search engine. And so a company like Google, who is an innovator in the space, potentially, I doubt they really are threatened. I expect Google, and they've even said they have their own platform that's better than ChatGPT in the wings, but it's not ready for prime time yet. That's what they've said in a recent article. But the other struggling search engines that are still alive out there, people may stop coming to them because instead of searching a word and getting a bunch of websites that you have to sift through, you can go ask a chatbot like ChatGPT a question, and it will bring you a product. It will tell you, here's your outline of the Battle of Gettysburg, not here's 5 sites about Gettysburg that you can sort of build an outline from that you have to cobble together. So, that's a disruption that is potentially coming from this kind of a natural language platform. So absolutely, I think the organization of the future, that network future, is shape-shifting precisely because it is keyed on its future. It's keyed on why it exists, and how over time some of the fundamentals of what it provides as a service or product change in order to continue to exist. Did that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And Steve, I really want to thank you. This was really thought-provoking. I think you already said you scratched the surface, and yeah, I believe you encouraged our audience to delve pretty deeply into this.
Well, I'll look forward. I'd really like to see the chat maybe, and if I can answer some questions or connect with you, or if you want to, if you're at National, you want to email me, I'm sjohnson7@nu.edu. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, I welcome continued conversations about this. As you can probably tell, I really enjoy thinking about this stuff, and I welcome thinking about it with others, because that's how I learn. And I really very much try to enact that associative thinking in how I exist as well.
Thanks, Steve. Nancy, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks for the attentiveness from the audience. I think you had everyone very, very captivated. And we always try to honor your time and close at at 1 hour. Sometimes our speakers are willing to take a few more questions at the end, and I don't know if Steve would be willing to, but if not, let me go ahead and just share a few things. First and foremost, certainly would like to thank Steve. I think you provided a lot of insights, things for people to think about within their own organizations as leaders, and really how they embrace innovation and where they are in that space, but certainly a lot of reflection is due. But we're very excited for our next speaker series. We are bringing back one of our former speakers, Katie Temple, and she's an executive media coach and consultant. And it should be very interesting on February 15th. So we welcome you to attend that. And on behalf of the alumni team, special thanks to Jen, Patricia, and Heather for coordinating the speaker series. We've had just so many interesting speakers. We will have a recording that will be posted on the site. So if you want to share Steve's talk with anyone, please feel free to send that link, and we'll have that posted by tomorrow. And Steve, do you have a moment to answer any more questions, or are you scheduled for your next meeting?
I do. I dropped in the chat. The Celtics don't start till 7:30, so I'm good for 30 minutes.
Right.
Well, as long as people can stay.
I'm thinking maybe just 5 or 10.
Sure,
but,
that's fine.
On behalf of National University, thank you for joining us for the speaker series. And John, I'll let you pick 2 more questions. How's that?
That works perfectly. So there's so many good ones. So here's one, Steve. How many of us, including educators, you already talked about lawyers and maybe doctors and so forth and so on, should feel threatened about this revolution in AI? And if we do feel threatened, what should we do about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's very hard not to feel threatened, right? Especially, it's very human. We're emotional first, and when you spend your life doing something and you see a technology there, you can go back to the Luddites, right, and their responses to weaving, and in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, right, and they sort of rose up and fought against that. But it's perfectly natural. Noah Harari just says the amount of change is happening, you feel bewildered first. So I think one, you have to embrace your own emotions. I mean, that's the start of that. When you have that anxiety, when you sort of have the, oh my goodness. And it doesn't help that our culture is so full of dystopias. So when you see these things play out, they often play out in a dystopia. The things to recognize and be optimistic about are, you're not the first humans that this has happened to, and it's happened in many different spaces. And it doesn't mean demise. Demise happens, from my experience, when all you do is play defense and you try to sandbag yourself into something, and like, I'm going to defend, the world will pass you by ultimately. what happens is we get at our best when we start thinking about, okay, what can I do with this? What don't I know about it? And how do we use it better? So there's so many examples, but since we were talking about ChatGPT, I'll just go there because it's on a lot of people's minds. There are, I'm sure, colleagues of mine who are still in composition thinking this thing is taking my job. And yet there's so much we don't know about what a tool like this does. There's so much we haven't explored with it. There's so much possibility. And even just the fact we assume because of what we've done, we know how the human learns. We assume that the technique we're using is the best way to make learning happen per se. So, in higher ed, if we're truly always students and always learning as much as we're teaching and helping others learn, we really have to get into that humility of, let me learn what this is first and help us be responsible with how we use something. Because I think, there's also to the probably large percentage of people who go to anxiety, there's also the people who are just, yeah, bring it on. This is going to be great. This is all going to work out. Right. And so there's a danger in that kind of response to massive change as well. And so there's, I think, it really gives people a lot of work to do and a lot of ways to think about what's important. So by example, I heard somebody say, what we often ask the question about what's the future of something? What's the future of neuroscience? And somebody said the place to start is reframing the question. It's not what's the future of neuroscience, it's what's the future of the problem that we currently solve with neuroscience. So, ChatGPT is not what's the future of law, it's what's the future of the problems that the legal system solves. And I think if we start to reframe the question, that's a first step for most people to get out of their anxiety, because it gets them focused in a different spot between what I'm losing. Again, and these changes are mourning for people, just like the pandemic was mourning for people because of I'm isolated, I'm in a small place, potentially, those kinds of things. This kind of disruptive change can be a mourning period because you value what you do. You value the hard work you put into things that suddenly seems all of this stuff I've done maybe feels irrelevant to me now. But it doesn't mean that your brain's not needed. It doesn't mean, I saw today an article in Italy, there's now a robot that they built that can carve marble statues. And so the claim was sort of, well, it can do 99% of the work, but the last 1%, that's still a really important human consideration, is sort of what they laid out there. That's an overwhelming, I'm sure that's an overwhelming feel for an artist. So you go to ChatGPT, you go to some of the new the AI image producers, as artists in the same kind of spot, right? Not only what is art, but like, who's allowed to be an artist, for Pete's sake? So I think it's okay to start there, but it's just remembering those perspectives. And it helps by going back and, start historically, look laterally. There's a great book, The Great Upheaval by Scott Van Pelt, and I'm forgetting his co-author's name, but they do a great job of foresight by starting with change and looking back at higher education. It was agrarian in the 18th and 19th system. It served an agrarian economic system. Theologians and wealthy folks came to higher ed for polishing. And there was much consternation during the first and second industrial revolutions about what the curriculum needed to be and how it needed to change. Did Greek still need to be in the curriculum? And the science stuff, that's vocational. We don't need science in the curriculum. We don't need engineering. These were hard discussions that happened across the 19th century, but then stabilized. I think for higher education, just since this is mainly a higher ed group, we have a similar paradigm shift ahead. We have similar considerations. And so again, to the anxiety, it's not anxiety of everything going away. It's anxiety in terms of how do you shape. One personal anecdote, my mom was a high school business teacher. She taught shorthand as one of her many recurrent classes. For those of you who remember shorthand and dictation of letters, that went away within like a matter of years because of the word processor. Gone. That was a lot of personal angst at the time, but I think when she looks at her career, it was a bump in the road. So again, from a personal perspective, these things aren't just happening to us, they've happened before. That's a good place to get comfort. And then look laterally at what's happened. Van Pelt goes into the newspaper industry, the film industry, music, and you can see both the mistakes and the opportunities that happen in the face of disruption. And that lateral thinking gives you some really good ideas about where you are and what you may need to be doing.
There is a lot of good advice there. I appreciate that. So now the final question. And I'm going to take this question and I'm going to add a little bit to it. So someone wants you to comment on their favorite show, Shark Tank. But in addition to commenting on Shark Tank, those of us in the education space, what can we do that sort of parallels Shark Tank? And I think of pitch events where we can encourage students to be innovative. Now, I sort of answered the question, but I want more from you. Do you think these type of events can create a culture of innovation? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I don't know much about Shark Tank. I apologize. I know enough about it to be dangerous, so I'm probably not going to reference the show directly. What where I would start, John, is where I started earlier. Is like we have an overarching responsibility as educators. Think about in changing contexts, what do we see people need to learn? What is the knowledge they need access to in order to conduct their lives and for a university to be the public good that it is. So I think you have to start there to go, well, what do you want a culture of innovation for with your students? And what I would answer to that is, if you're not familiar, the term VUCA, it came out of the U.S. Army War College. Institute for the Future uses it often. The world ahead is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so for students who come to higher education for learning, for knowledge, and for the ability to embrace opportunities ahead of them, what do they need? It would seem to me entrepreneurship and innovation cultivate skills, as I was talking about, of generalism, and generalism in Epstein's range is really an anecdote for that VUCA world in many regards. It is, we're really good. We really need experts when things are stable. Experts can go deep, life is recurrent, but when things are shifting around us, the generalist, according to Epstein's research, tends to be more successful. And so I think we need to consider that as we're going forward.
Steve, thank you for staying, and thanks for the great advice. Really good stuff. I think I'll now hand it over back to Nancy to bring us home.
Hey, thank you, John. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
We really are going to close now. Special thanks, I think, for those of you who stayed past the formal close for the 2 additional questions. Those were really interesting responses, and Steve, just a lot of additional insight and things for everybody to think about, and it really added value to the overall presentation. Thank you to all of our students, our alumni, community members, faculty and staff who participated. We will get a copy of the recording posted, and we'll definitely share all the questions with Dr. Johnson, and maybe we'll bring him back for a part 2 on this topic, or look to provide some of those answers for you. But I think it's something that we will continue to contemplate in whatever sector we work in. And it was just really an honor to have you share your expertise. And National University is very fortunate to have you as the Vice President of Innovation, and certainly Dr. Cicero as our provost. So thanks to everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you being here. Thanks so much.